arrangement, but today, immediately after this, the anthropology undergraduate honors program is having their mini conference in which the anthro honors students present their research, and that'll be at 2. So they've asked us, and so the chairs are arranged for that, and they've asked us to please try to make the transition so they can get in here at 1:30. So we'll have questions up until 1:30, but I'll try to cut it off pretty quickly right then so we can be on time and they can get started. I should mention that we have a Beck Talk in normal time this coming Monday. We have Elizabeth Tilsworth from Cal State Fullerton who's talking about maid choice among the Shuar of Ecuador. So please come to that at noon on Monday. And today it is my pleasure to introduce Doug Kenrick from Arizona State University, Department of Psychology, who will be talking about evolutionary social cognition and biases and phenomena in how people think about the social world.
This is a visual abstract of my talk. This primes all the correct cognitive associations. And now it'll just be words from here on in. Fill in the rest of it. And here's the kind of one-liner press release version, stolen from Jung's treatise on human nature a few centuries ago. Reason is the slave of the passions. Recognize those people. So I just showed you, if you weren't looking at your food, I'll pop them up one more time. When we do research on these topics, some of which was done with Janessa, we ask questions like, we'll show you a bunch of faces and then ask later, do you remember any of them? We give you a more rigorous test than this, but if I were to ask you, say, how many of the people in that photograph were men as opposed to women, could you get it right? And if I ask you a more specific question, one of the women in that picture is a white woman with dark hair. Could you tell me where she was in the array? And would you give me a different answer? Would you be better at this task or worse at this task if you entered and, say, came into the room and you were in a romantic mood, or if you were in an anxious mood, worrying about potential threats, if somebody threatened you while you were driving over here today. Now, the field of social cognition, basically the part of social psychology that deals with how we think about other people, has traditionally searched for domain general processes. And we've assumed that content is irrelevant, that I use the same mental processes when I am thinking about letters, speaking of Guy Van Orden and the word nerd thing, that there's famous review papers on social cognition that in fact explicitly say that if you understand how people think about letters and go from letters to words, you'll understand basically all you need to know about cognition, including things of how we judge social effects. And there's a whole generation of studies, like priming studies, where the word jazz would appear rapidly on the screen, and we look at how that influenced your responses to black people. The assumption is that what's inside our head are a bunch of little semantic networks, which there are some in there, but we think there's more going on. Then there was a kind of a shift to what they called hot social cognition, basically looking at, sometimes when people think about other people, they're aroused, okay, or they're in a particular emotional state. And so we started to study the effects of emotion and arousal on cognition. But even when we did that, we tend to think in domain general terms. So we talked about like general arousal. So you do that by having people do push-ups or drink some coffee, and the assumption was that those are all more or less the same thing. You're aroused, so that's what you're feeling when you're in love or in the dentist chair, and that's more or less the same deal. And then we start to get a little bit more modular and talk about positive versus negative moods, and or a little bit more domain specific. If you don't like the word modular, like I we just talked about a colleague of mine who gets very upset at the word modular because he didn't seem to understand Barrett and Kurzman's arguments. But in any event, when we talk about positive and negative mood, that has a little bit of a problem in that, well, a negative mood would include anger, fear, disgust, okay? When you start to think about hot cognition in the context of kind of an evolutionary frame of mind, you know, we presume in my lab and a lot of other, you know, labs, a lot of, you know, people here and at UCSB where I was yesterday, the model that we have is that when I think about things, I'm going to understand thinking a little bit better if I think about the mind as not just a whole bunch of neurons that you know are kind of unprogrammed and have nothing to do with one another, but the mind is basically designed to dig out certain kinds of information that are prioritized according to their functional relevance. Some kinds of things are going to matter more to me, and I'm going to think about them in different ways. The research I'm going to tell you about stems from a premise that what I pay attention to, how I encode it or interpret it, and whether or not I remember, say, another person, as well as the links between how much attention and how much memory are going to be designed to serve adaptive ends. My friend David Funder is an old friend of mine. He's at Riverside, where I'm heading tomorrow. A lot of them say I'm doing like a Southern California tour. But Funder has a couple of papers in which paper in BDS, for example, and a paper in Psych Review, where he talks about the fact that psychologists are kind of obsessed with the negative. We love to uncover ways in which people's judgments are foolish or pathological or just kind of generally nasty, and then use those, turn those into amusing anecdotes to tell our students. Here's a finding that shows how stupid you are. And I'm kind of the school of social cognition that assumes that cognitive processes are, yes, we make a lot of mistakes, but ultimately our mistakes reflect an underlying deeper rationality. Now, just so you won't be bored in advance with this kind of Pollyannish view of the way that works, I can promise you that the findings I'm going to talk about suggest that even though we have these deeply intelligent heuristics, they still result in some dumb-looking biases. And sometimes people are remarkably accurate in the way we process other people, but for self-serving, racist, and sexist reasons. So if you're a social psychologist, don't tune out yet. So another couple of assumptions, stuff I'm going to be talking about. Again, that we assume that there's an inherent connection, that cognition is always, or almost always, hot. And that, it's, again, the reason is the slave of the passions. Basically, the assumption is that the mind is composed of adaptive systems that are designed to link particular sets of stimuli out there to particular emotional and motivational responses inside my head and my body in such a way as to kind of serve specialized functional goals. And the model that we play with a lot in my lab is based upon this idea, and I don't assume that these are rigid little modules, but I do believe that there's a set of problems that humans need to solve. Our ancestors and humans today did better to the extent to which they were good at forming friends as compared to losing friends, at protecting themselves from the bad guys who wanted to get the things that they had or hurt them, at keeping the status or gaining status, at finding mates, and at retaining mates, and those are two separate problems, and at offspring care. And an assumption the kind of working assumption that we make is that we guess based upon, things, like Barrett and Kurzban reviewed, and a couple of other kind of classic papers. There's the sort of the Sherry and Schachter paper in Psych Review a number of years ago that really, I think, did a beautiful job of making the case for the fact that, like, even in bird brains, there's different kinds of processes that apply to different kinds of information. And we presume that, well, let's see how far that takes us in social psychology. We presume that there's qualitatively different cognitive processes, and that the way that I think and feel about my child and my mate they're going to be different from one another, and different from the way I think and feel about friends and about enemies and about superiors. All of these are not variants of the same kind of domain general rules. So to give one simple example, if we're in a business exchange relationship, I expect you to do tit-for-tat record keeping. I'm not surprised if we have a business relationship and you want to charge me for the things that that you do for me or give to me, and want kind of keep it carefully dollar for dollar. But if I'm in a romantic relationship and you start doing that to me, I start to think things aren't going so well. That's a bad sign. We don't do tit for tat economic record keeping in romantic relationships. And if you have a child, not only do you not do tit for tat record keeping, you'd be shocked if they, I have a 32-year-old son who went to NYU to study film, and he may have once thanked me, but he might not have. I don't hold it against him, as it turns out. It's kind of like, if he needs money now, I'll still give it to him. With a degree in film, you sometimes still need money now. Again, though, I wouldn't have done that for, I like Janessa, my son is a wonderful guy, he's a nice guy, but Janessa's even nicer, and yet I've never given her any money, she's given me publications, and still, no money from me, and if she wanted to take out a loan for her house, I'd say, talk to your dad, and she's really been very nice to me. But nevertheless, the assumption is that just basically we calculate things differently for different people. So at the risk of kind of insulting Hume's elegant statement, I'm of the school of thought that has doubts about a monolithic mind. That what's reasonable in one decision-making domain might be unreasonable in another. So we'd have to change reason to say, reasons are the slave of the passions. I still think Hume was right, but I don't think there's one reasoning mechanism inside the brain. I'll give you one little pitch for a paper. I'm not going to talk about this. It's just going to appear in like the next week or so. I have a paper in Perspectives on Psychological Science, which psychologists know that it's a relatively new kind of theoretical journal in the field, and we actually take these ideas about these fundamental motives and put it together with the classic kind of Maslow hierarchy of motives and what we know about life history theory and about motivation and evolution in the 40 or 50 years since Maslow did this. This is kind of one of these, the Maslow, I'm sure you probably all know this, but it's a very popular meme. It's still out there in like organizational books, and it's out there in all introductory psychology textbooks. And so we kind of revisit and do a couple of things to it. I'm not going to tell you all about it, but one of the things is, if you remember from intro psych, there's something at the top called self-actualization, which we kind of knocked out of its cherished place and put it actually down mostly in getting status and esteem. It's like musicians who want to, and Maslow thought musicians perform just for the pleasure, but we think, no, they're doing it to get status, and that's ultimately going to get the mates. And Maslow didn't talk at all about reproduction, oddly enough. That was not a fundamental human motive for him. He had sex, and it was down in basic physiology. It's sort of like, you have to drink when you're thirsty, and you could, masturbate or have sex. No connection whatsoever to reproduction in Maslow's model. But he had interesting ideas, and so we kind of are connecting with that. But what I'm going to talk about now are kind of rigorous experiments and not humanistic philosophy. But I do think that there's an inherent connection between those two things. So anyway, the general approach in our lab is we activate different motivational states. We might show you a scary movie or a romantic movie. We might have you imagine yourself in a scary or status-related situation. And then what we do is we look at how that how those different motivational states differentially affect things, different levels of processing and behavior. So, for example, you walk into a crowded room, like I just did. Who do you look at? And we do studies. We use eye trackers and something called change blindness methods, where some little thing changes a detail. It gives you an idea of whether people were paying attention to. Did they notice that that a head just came off one of the stimuli? Those people from before. That's the kind of array that we use. Not that exact one, but we also look at encoding. So you see a facial expression. Is this woman looking in a kind of a sultry, seductive way? Or is she a little annoyed? Is she happy? Or what's going on? If you try to infer what her emotions were, which we do a lot of, there's a lot of research on people's inferences about emotions. And we study something that we call functional projection, which is the tendency for people to sometimes attribute underlying states to others that aren't necessarily there, but to do it differentially. We have pounds of effects. So men in a romantic frame of mind think that a beautiful woman, and only a beautiful woman, is suppressing sexual feelings. Scared people think that males from other racial groups are suppressing angry feelings. I'm not going to talk about that stuff, but then we study memory. So this is a face. Was this guy in the crowd before? Janessa, do you know? Janessa doesn't know. She's seen them all. Some of you guys know? He was, I think, in the crowd before. But even though you look at faces, you don't always remember them. But there's some selectivity in memory. And funny things happen with handsome men, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Lately we have a grant from NSF to study, instead of just these basic cognitive processes, we're now studying sort of more complex decisions. So, like this is the standard kind of cognitive diversity risk aversion curve. Do people's behavioral, economic decisions change as a function of what motivational state they're in? And then finally, we do a number of studies of more downstream social behaviors. So does being in one of these different motivational states change the probability of your displaying creativity, or if you're being a nonconformist or a conformist, or of acting aggressively or non-aggressively, or even of saying you believe in God? We have some. I'm not going to talk about those. We have some interesting findings on that, though. But what I'm going to talk to you mostly about now is some serendipitous findings where I put this timer at the top of the screen and it says, I've been talking for 36 minutes. And I'm thinking, wow, that went fast. Yeah, no, I turned it on before. And I'm thinking, well, what's the actual time? Oh, it's there.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. It's nothing like it. Yeah, got it. All right. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about what we call disjunctions between early and later information processing that tend to violate a normal linear order. Sometimes we look at people but then forget them later. Sometimes you look away from someone and then remember them reasonably well later. Now, there's an assumption that is traditionally made in cognitive psychology, and it's intuitively kind of obvious, and in fact it's mostly correct, but that basically that these processes are linear and additive. So for example, my ability to remember a person is going to depend on my initial attention. I obviously can't remember someone I didn't look at. And what we presume, and this is generally true, the longer I look at somebody, the more chance. If I have an interview with somebody today, which I just talked to a couple of different people, the more I look at somebody, the more chance I'm going to encode that person. And the more encoding, the easier it is for me to recall that person later. And that's generally true, but we're looking for the places where that goes offline, okay, or off linear, the linear model. Now, when we find these unexpected linearities, again, with our model, we are going to guess. Our first assumption is not just you know, ha ha ha, there's another place where people do something kind of funny and weird, like social psychologists have traditionally done. But we start with this assumption, well, maybe there's something, maybe there's actually some reason for this, and maybe it's, you know, it makes some kind of an adaptive sense. And we kind of search around for those kinds of discrepancies. Not that people don't just do unreasonable and random things, but we're looking for the places where the discrepancies seem to make sense. So here's the first series of studies I'll tell you about. They suggest that there's something funny about the way that people process handsome men. This is John Maynard, who's now at Florida State, sitting in front of an eye tracker, and he's looking at, recognize that eye? He's looking at someone's eye, which is basically the subject sits in front of a computer screen, and there's a little laser device underneath that kind of tracks where their eye goes, and the subject, who in this case is Janessa Shapiro, wears a little magnetic headband, so that when the head moves, which can throw the whole thing off. You know, in the old days, you used to have to sort of glue the thing to your head, but now you can, you know, get information fed into the computer that allows correction. We can keep pretty good track of where somebody's eye goes onto an array. And so here's, you know, this is an imaginary array. And let's imagine that Janessa was looking at it. We can get a printout that's like this, that's a graphic print of where she stopped. Okay, you get a little dot every time she stopped. And then, you know, the dot gets bigger when she spent more time on a particular array. This really isn't what Janessa looked at, but Noah's not here anyway, so people will be jealous. But you might expect that women would generally look at the better-looking guys more than the average guys. But again, when we started, we didn't know what we'd find with regard to a lot of this stuff. There really were not many studies of basic attention of this sort. And anyway, here's what we found with that simple question. Who do people look at in arrays like I just showed you? So in this study, the stimuli were always arrays of men, and they were always, some of those photos were kind of blurry, but what we show are really photos that are, where they're all the same resolution and so forth. And they're often, I don't know if those were in color in that one originally, but it's an array that kind of looks like what I just showed you, not exactly, but it's half attractive and half average looking people as judged by another group of subjects. And sometimes you're looking at men and sometimes you're looking at women. And we're just letting you look at the screen and we're seeing who you look at. Now if you're a guy and you look at a screen full of guys, half of them are good looking, half of them are average. This is what we found. That line, the dashed line, is basically no preference for attractive men. If it goes up, it means they spend a higher percentage of the time on attractive faces. Down here, it means they're spending relatively more time on the unattractive than the attractive faces. So men have no particular preference for attractiveness in men's faces. Right? No shocking surprise there. And here's another non-shocking surprise. Did NSF give us a grant to find out that men look at attractive women? Probably not. But we found it. We discovered it. Evolutionary psychology. See, no wonder there's so much press. It's so annoying. They discovered that men look at attractive. We discovered this amazing thing. Men spent more time looking at beautiful women than average-looking women. So it's like, you know, say 63 to 30 something. Again, non-shocking. We didn't know what to find with women. Would they, you know, we thought they might look at attractive women more, and they did. Women spent not as much as men, but they favored beautiful women in arrays. And that's true when you walk across campus. What would they do with men? We actually weren't quite sure, you know, but we suspected that we get something like we got. Yeah, they look at the good-looking guys. So nothing too shocking or surprising here, right? Men don't care whether a guy's good-looking or not in terms of his visual attention allocation, but they are very drawn to beautiful women. Women are drawn to both beautiful women and to handsome men, okay? But now the interesting disjunctions are going to come up. Another study we did, Andy Delton, some of you know, did this in his honors thesis. In this case, we showed people single photographs, male and female faces, and the hair was actually taken away from them. So it's just a facial photograph. And the photos were either male or female, attractive and average. And again, one at a time now. And later we show you those photos again and ask you, did you see this person before? And to make it a little bit more difficult task, there are other photos that are also male or female, attractive or average, of the same, general set. And so do you get it right or not? Well, here's what we find with men. When it comes to, this is recognition memory. Do you recognize the face as one that you saw before? Men don't recognize an attractive man's face more than an average man's face. That should be unsurprising, right? Remember, I just showed you they don't look at the attractive men more, so what, right? That's what you'd expect. With women, even though they spent less time looking at the unattractive women, they still do generally better with recognizing women, but they do especially a good job at remembering attractive women. Again, unsurprising, all what you, I think, more or less would expect. They look at the beautiful women, and they remember the beautiful women, okay? Here's what women do. Women, with average-looking people, they're a little bit better at recognizing an average-looking woman, and same as men, than an average-looking man. They're also better at remembering the good-looking women than the average-looking women. No surprise, they look more at them. Now, if this is all working in the normal way, as everything has been so far, you should see what I've got up there in that ghost bar. The women should be really good at remembering handsome men because they looked more. They looked even more at handsome men than they did at beautiful women. But that's not what we found. Otherwise, this would get to be a very boring talk if this just continued on. Exactly, yeah. What we found was something, and we replicate this again and again. Women don't remember handsome men. They look at them, they do not remember them. And we've done this, Von Becker did a study of concentration game where you have a whole bunch of, got to turn over tiles and there's faces behind them. And everybody's good at getting the beautiful women. And if we show you all the faces before the game, so you can see them for 4 seconds, enough time to glance them all over, on the first trial, women do good with handsome men. After that, the handsome men lose their benefit. It's like, it just seems, it seems to be that women are having an initial attention to, but no memory for handsome men. Now here's a study we did, everybody's now doing ovulation studies, and so we did a study in which we looked at, well, what's going to happen with ovulating women? Ovulating women do a whole bunch of different things, they flirt, they look at men, attractive. Marty has uncovered all of these horrifying things about those nasty ovulating women. They act like men, They're looking at attractive members of the opposite sex, especially if their partner isn't that attractive, and wearing less clothing and, sexier clothing, moving differently, having different preferences in mates. So we thought, well, maybe ovulating women will look at and remember the handsome men. That would be the obvious expectation. And so we did a study of looking time, this is basically showing you women who are now, the blue bars refer to women who are in the non-fertile period, and the yellow bars refer to women in the high fertile period, as judged by, we counted backward from the next period. So there's going to be some error, which will work against us getting anything, right? But when it comes to looking at average-looking men, there's no difference between high fertility and low fertility women. When it comes to looking at attractive men, the low fertility women do look at them more, again, what you generally expect. In fact, ovulating women look significantly longer at the handsome men, okay? So far, this looks like that whole they're acting like guys kind of a thing. Then we looked at their memory. And what we found is they're a little bit, ovulating women are a little bit better at remembering average men. They looked at them a little bit longer, as you might recall from that graph a second ago. And again, what we should expect is there should be a big boost for the handsome men. And the data suggests it's no bigger than the boost for average men. In fact, it's not significantly different than the non-ovulating women. We've done a number of studies like this now. We have something that we call we calculate the bang for the buck. So I'll refer to this in a second. I'll show you some more data on it. But it looks at the amount of memory given a second of attention, how good are you at remembering somebody? And typically, the more you look, the more you should get, more memory. High bang for the buck means that you're getting a little extra oomph in your memory, more than you'd expect. For one category of faces, the number of seconds doesn't perfectly predict. And sort of with the handsome men, what you can just say about ovulating women is that there's no bang for the buck. They're looking at them, they're not forgetting them, but they're not getting any extra oomph in their memory. So handsome men seem to be processed briefly by women, but then they're kind of discarded from downstream processing. We get a reverse pattern of disjunction for outgroup males. Another paper that I have Janessa's name highlighted whenever it occurs here. But another paper that just appeared in what is this journal called? It's Social Psychology's version of Psych Science, which goes out to all the people, it's like 7,000 people. So we think it's going to be a high impact journal, but we don't yet know. So this will be one of the test cases. This gets cited a lot. In 5 years, we'll be glad we published it there. But at any rate, in this study, what we did is we looked at memory for African American males. And I looked at memory for a bunch of categories. I'm going to show you the African American males and then show you some others in a second. But here's what we found, and this fits with some of the functional projection stuff I told you about a minute ago, that people who are feeling frightened are actually better at remembering African American men, okay, than when they're not frightened. So there's a boost. Fear increases our subjects are white and Hispanic. We have very few African Americans, not even enough to analyze, but white and Hispanic students, when they're frightened, are better at remembering black men. Now, maybe it's because they look more at them when they're frightened. And you can think about that. We actually had it in our grant recently. We predicted that people who were frightened would look more at outgroup males. But it's one of those stupid predictions, but it's good to have predictions that prove false. This proved very false. We've gotten this again and again and again. When people are frightened, if anything, they look less at outgroup males. They certainly don't look more. And if you think about it now, yeah, you're walking down the street, you're scared, it's late at night, you're in like a tough neighborhood. Are you going to look at the guys that you're worried about? But interestingly enough, when you compare attention and memory, what you're getting is, given this is this bang for the buck thing, given the amount, this low attention, you're getting surprisingly good memory. So you're getting, a kind of a memory benefit per unit attention for black men when white and Hispanic subjects are frightened. You might wonder what happens with other faces. It's just that people are, when you're frightened, you're really good at remembering all kinds of faces. So that's just replotting this in a different way. This is the memory benefit for African American men that's produced by fear. For African American women, it's above the line, but it's actually not significantly above, above the line. It's not as much as for the African American women. That's men. It's what we typically find. People are more afraid. They're afraid of African American men, not of African American women. What about, Caucasian women? There's no difference from zero. Caucasian men, they're not. It's not just that we remember all men when we're frightened. People remember, they have a bang for the buck on African American men when they're frightened. So we're finding two patterns of disjunction here. Here's what you might call the expected relationship. You do expect some kind of linear relationship between my amount of attention and my memory. And sometimes we find amplification, which is what you might expect for things that you don't want to forget, but you might not want to stare at. Okay. Whereas suppression are effects for things that are either unimportant, you look at them and they just don't register. It's like you're looking at the sky while you're having a conversation, you're not really remembering to look at the clouds, okay? And that's what handsome men seem to be. Now, another possibility is that maybe women are actively suppressing their memory for handsome men. We don't yet know what's going on there. But we certainly do have these two interesting patterns of discrepancies in cognition that are related to the motivational state that people are in, and that make some functional sense and raise, I think, interesting questions for future research. Now, presumably, both my biases and my accuracies which aren't always discrepant, as it turns out. But some of the things, sometimes I'm biased in my cognition, sometimes I'm accurate. We would presume that they're both serving functional purposes. And there are several other places where we have found people are especially accurate in their processing. So here's one, again with Janessa as a co-author, in which we looked at, there's a phenomenon called outgroup homogeneity, which is this, that we look at members of other racial groups, and we aren't that good at discriminating them, okay? So it's the sort of, they all look the same to me phenomenon. And it's been shown again and again and again. So typically what you'd expect is that if you're looking at a bunch of faces and you're a white subject, that you're going to be better at remembering this guy specifically as distinct from other white guys, as opposed to that guy as distinct from other black guys. But what happens if the faces have some emotional expression on them? In particular, what if they have a threatening look, like they're angry? So here's some data on this. Now we have two conditions here. One is the difficult condition on the left and the easy condition on the right. Difficult here because you see a face plus a distraction, an artwork appears on the screen and a face at the same time, and they're only up for half a second. In another case, you see just the face, and it's up there for 4 seconds, which is kind of a long time, when all you're looking at is a face on the screen. It's a reasonable amount of time to kind of take a gander at the face. So you expect people will be better on the right than on the left. But one of the things we find is that for neutral facial expressions, now here we're looking at males. They're all males in this experiment, the photos. People are white and Hispanic subjects, again, are not as good at remembering black as compared to whites. That's the old outgroup homogeneity effect. When it's an easier task, they're better at remembering both of them, but significantly less good at remembering the black guys. So make it easier, a difficult task, and white subjects aren't as good at discriminating. It's got a failure to discriminate that might be discriminating, I think Vanessa might have used that term. But what happens when the face is angry? Well, in the easy case, it doesn't do anything. They're already up close to 100% accuracy for the white males, and that doesn't change. But then we get a boost for the black men. In fact, now black men are as memorable as white men. If a black angry guy is as memorable as a white angry guy. What about over here in the difficult condition when your cognitive resources are strained? Then we get actually what we call outgroup heterogeneity. Here, the black guy is remembered better than the white guy if he's angry, and if it's a difficult task. If your cognitive resources are limited, and you see a potentially threatening person, then, which our subjects do regard African American men as distinct from African American women, as distinct from white people in general, as more likely to be associated with physical violence. More attention is allocated for, in fact, more accuracy. Now, here we did it for Asians, and it's going to, in a second you'll see why I should actually use some slightly different words than what I just said. This replicates what I showed you before. With the difficult condition, we're getting homogeneity for neutral faces, heterogeneity. We're getting better memory for the angry black men, worse memory for the neutral black men in the difficult task. That replicates what I just showed you in another study. What about when they're Asians, who white subjects at ASU don't associate Asians with threat. They don't think Asian guys are going to beat them up. And so what will we get? Now, we actually thought this could have gone either way. And maybe in our lab, we probably went around the room and all voted on what we guessed, and we probably split right down the middle. But Janessa probably predicted the right thing, and I predicted the wrong thing, so that often is the way it works. We found no angry expressions did not enhance your memory for Asian men. Now here's another, is it just any emotion on the face? Well, maybe it's just that we associate, we see blacks as emotional or something, more so than Asians and whites. So it's, here again is a replication of what I showed you before. This is an easy condition. where there's only the face for 4 seconds. And what we find is, that, again, we get an erasure such of outgroup homogeneity. People are less good at remembering black guys if they're neutral, but if they're angry, they remember them as well as they remember the white angry guys. Now, what about if they're happy? So we did another condition in which we actually used the same neutral faces, but instead of having half the faces be angry, half of the faces were happy. Hard to do when you're a guy in Queens. We're taught. We do believe in culture. And there's strong culture. In my neighborhood, a guy smiling was you get beat up. I'm better at scowling. I still got beat up, but I assume it's going to help. All right, so here's what we find. For the neutral faces, they're again better at remembering the whites than the blacks. And for the happy faces, they're just kind of bad at remembering them all. What happens is now the white guys, happy white, normally we remember white guys, but if they're smiling, we now forget them. It doesn't do anything to our memory for black guys. So it isn't like just emotion on a black face has some particular magic. It's that happiness makes both whites and blacks forgettable. And there's another interesting thing in this data, which we have to publish this soon. This is something I really love about this data set. Those neutral faces were the same neutral faces. Sometimes the neutral faces were they were interspersed with happy faces. So the crowd you saw was sometimes neutral, sometimes happy. Happy crowd. The same neutral faces in the context of happy people are forgettable. We'd like to forget everybody. If it's a nice, it looks like a happy day on the beach, it's like we're not remembering anybody. If it looks like there's some dangerous people out there on the street, we're remembering even the neutral people. So we're doing better at remembering everybody when there's some anger, potential threats in the environment. Especially remember the angry people, but we also remember the neutral people. So speaking of anger, I'll tell you about another study by Vaughn Becker and Steve Newberg and a couple of other our colleagues. We found another place with very rapid and accurate encoding, which is, I think, kind of it's interesting for reasons I'll talk about as we get through it. But this is one of these ridiculous tasks, okay? And you guys are cognitive psychologists. You know that sometimes cognitive psychologists do these ridiculous tasks. Is this a word? Put this thing up, is it a word? Sometimes it's a word, right? Like we're doing something. Is this face angry or happy? That's is this a word? It's not a very tough task, okay? These are Ekman faces, in fact, that we started out with. We used lots of other arrays and we got the same thing, but it's yeah, the guy is angry, the woman is happy, okay? And our subjects are, they're good at it, unsurprisingly. And what we were measuring, though, in this case, is how fast how rapid are they making this decision? And here's what we found. If it's anger and it's on a man's face, people are quicker to say it's angry. So, again, so the DV here is, are you fast? You're fast at all of these things. It's not a tough task. The human mind is designed to detect emotion quite well, and we're very good at detecting anger. And if it's on a guy, we're faster, significantly faster. We've replicated this a number of times. If it's a woman, and again, this is replicated a number of times, if she's happy, we're better at getting happiness on a woman than on a man. We're better at getting anger on a man than a woman. And is it because of what Vaughn Becker calls a speed-accuracy trade-off? Is it because I can get faster and make more errors? But that ain't what happens here. Basically, they're just as good, if not a little bit better, at being accurate. The accuracy scores are close to 100%. Okay, but they're especially good. They're fast and good at getting angry men, and they're fast and good at getting happy women. Actually, makes the only place where they made any substantial mistakes is if it's a happy guy, they sometimes press the wrong button. But usually people are quite accurate at this. And that's still pretty accurate. It's just some mistakes were made for the. We also flipped it around and we said, "Is the same face that I showed you? It's not a tough task, right? Is that a man or a woman?" Again, a ridiculous task in many ways. But we found something interesting. If the face is angry, people are quicker to say it's a man than they are to say it's a woman. And again, this is not a tough task. They're as you'll see in a second, they're usually right. If the face is happy, they're quicker to say it's a woman as well. So it isn't just that we detect the emotion, we're also detecting the sex. more quickly. And here's the hit rates to show, again, it's not speed, accuracy trade-offs. They're actually, they're faster and more accurate at saying it's a man when it's angry. They are faster and more accurate at saying it's a woman when the face is happy. Now, maybe just women are better at making happy faces and men are better at making angry faces. So Vaughan constructed some, is this called Poser, the program? It's a program that creates artificial lifelike faces. And so Vaughan created these faces, and you can kind of use a slider and make it more like a man, more like a woman, more happy, more angry. And so we made men's faces being happy, women's faces being angry, and get the same results, even with computer-generated faces. So it's not something that I don't think about the experience of men being better at making angry faces. Now, when we sent this paper in, reviewers said, kind of one of these things, this is a fun story because it's like one of those places where the reviewers are cocky, you know, and said, yeah, so what have you shown us? People mentally associate anger with men and happiness with women. It's a sort of it's a culturally learned phenomenon, and you know, big deal. But Vaughan thought it was facial physiognomy. There's actually something built into the face such that men's faces are actually, there's something about the male face that makes it easier to recognize anger on a male's face, like possibly a lower eyebrow is the one that he thought. But there's also men have larger jaws. Maybe maybe it's something about facial physiognomy. So using Poser, we were able to play with both of those things. Here's a face that an average subject at ASU would have rated, you know, half the time they choose man, half the time they choose woman, and you know, it's like it's an androgynous face, as you can see in a second. Because when I put clothes on it, they give it other characteristics to make it look masculine or feminine. It looks like a man over there, and it looks like a woman over here. So we added cultural cues to sex. We made it a cultural woman or a cultural man, but it has the same facial expression. This is the identical facial. Nothing's changing here. And then we tweaked around some of the facial features. So we made the face look a little more feminine by, you know, women have more rounded eyebrows, men have thicker lower eyebrows, men have bigger jaws, women have smaller jaws. So we tweaked a couple of those features, and what we should have found, if our reviewers were correct, is that when we see this, we think happy. When we see that on the right-hand side with the tie, we think angry, because we think of male association to anger, female association to happy. So what we did here is we looked, now this is a little bit, you'll follow this slide in a second, but it's got a couple of things going on. One is this person, first thing, is that face masculine or feminine? Now, if it's got the suit on, it's masculine. I'm not showing you here, but if it's got the dress on, people rate it as feminine. In fact, they thought, if you look back at the photos I showed you a second ago, and take that ambiguous face and put it on culturally cued masculine bodies, it looks like a guy. And they thought this looked like a guy, okay, when it had the suit on. Now, they should think it's angry. Now, we lower the eyebrow ridge, and that has a little bit of an effect on people's judgments that it's a male face. It looks a little more masculine when it's got a lowered eyebrow ridge, which it should, because men have lower eyebrow ridges. Also, that's a cue associated with anger. Now, is it angry? Well, the cultural cues did nothing to judgments. Categorizing that person as a man does not make you think it's angry. In fact, it's slightly in the wrong direction, but it's not even significant. There's no bleeding over of my judgment that it's a man to my judgment that it's angry. Okay, but if the eyebrow is lowered, we get a substantial increase in the perceptions of anger. So it's just it's fairly, I mean, in some sense, obvious if you know about kind of the facial morphology. But men's faces are better. We look angry all the time, okay, because of our eyebrow ridges, that seems to explain what's going on. Tell you also about some research on economic decisions. So quickly, behavioral economists like Kahneman, they study, it's kind of social cognition meets economic decision making. Kahneman and Tversky and others who followed have loved to show kind of irrational mistakes like loss aversion. So a dollar is a dollar, except when you're gaining it, it's worth more. It's actually worth less than when you're losing it. Okay. So people place, there's more change in utility from losing $50. It's more, there's more kind of a down boost to losing $50 than there is to an upward boost to gaining $50. And they've studied this in a number of ways, but this is actually a graph that you'll see now in a lot of introductory economic texts. So what we want to see is how do fundamental motives change that. And we predicted, actually in our grant, we had this graph where we said what we'd expect is that one of the predictions was that when we activate a mating motive, risk aversion should go away from men. Why? Because males, because of all the stuff on sexual selection and differential pearl investment, which I assume you've heard, many, many times. But so here's some data that we collected after that. Here, we ask you how, we've done this in a number of ways, how much would it change your happiness to have a boost in your economic assets or your social assets, having more friends, having more various kinds of things. And this is aggregated across a number of those. But generally, this is what women did in terms of their change in happiness as a function of a change in their assets. When we activated mating, that's nothing, is what it did for women. For men, though, men actually showed loss aversion more strongly than women in this data set. Men are basically saying it'll affect them more to lose something than to gain something. But now we activate mating motives, and that goes away. We basically erased loss aversion for men in the mating motive. And we later replicated this using a different dependent variable. And we've also found when we activate self-protection, I don't have a graph on it, but both sexes get a little bit more. When I'm frightened, whether I'm a man or a woman, I get more loss averse. Am I using that term correct? Loss. I keep mixing up loss aversion and risk aversion. It's what happens when you're interdisciplinary and don't read everything in each, I say the wrong thing. But I mean the right thing. So basically, what I'd say about this is that our simple understanding of the links between affect and cognition have been kind of evolving to take into account ideas from evolutionary biology and the integration of those ideas with cognitive science, which I was just yesterday at UCSB, so that's Levy Cosmides if you. So now we need to sort of really ruin Hume's statement and say that attention, encoding, and retrieval are the slaves of the limbic system, functionally modulated by adaptive context. I can show you 5 more minutes of interesting slides. Do you want to see them, or do you want to stop at this point?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll show you just some stuff on some more downstream social behaviors, including conformity, which I know some of you might be interested in, this conformity stuff. Here's a study. Goldstein is Mr. Shapiro, who's also here at UCLA, but couldn't come to my talk for political reasons, not to do with me. But the study that we did with Vlad Griskevicius and Noah and Bob Cialdini and Chad Mortensen, basically what we did here is we looked at conformity, so the old Asch style conformity. You see a bunch of other people make a judgment. And remember, in the Asch experiment, you saw, this is the real subject on the right who's looking at the line that the other people all said that the long line was slightly shorter, than they said the wrong thing. And Asch found that sometimes people went along with the group and went against their own judgments. This happens much more with ambiguous stimuli that there really is not a correct answer to, for example, than it does with line length. But what we did is we activated different motives to see what it would do to various kinds of conformity if you go along with the group. And here's an example of one of the stimuli we might have used. Is that an interesting or an uninteresting picture there? And before you can make your judgment, you see 3 other people register their judgments, they all think it's quite interesting. Well, do you go along with it? Now, in the control, we knew from, the subject didn't regard that as either that interesting or uninteresting, but do you go along with them or not go along with them? Well, the answer depends upon what motivational state you're in. If you're feeling frightened, as compared to the control condition when you're feeling there's no arousal, both men and women become more conforming than we expect them to. Okay. What about when you're in a mating frame of mind? Well, women who are thinking about mating become more conforming than they normally do. Women go along when they're thinking about mating. Men go against the group. Men become anti-conforming when they're sort of showing off. I'll breeze through a couple of other quick ones here. I think they're all easy to kind of grasp. But in one, simple, I just asked students in some classes, and we asked students in some other classes at other universities. Think of a time, we told them about the Thorstein Veblen kind of conspicuous consumption, spending in such a way as to show that you have resources. Have you ever seen somebody do that? Now tell us about it, and we record it. Is it a man or a woman? Well, both sexes, men more so than women, but both sexes tended to remember a man spending in a showy way, conspicuously consuming. Now, why is that? Well, we think it might have something to do with with some of the stuff that I've been talking about. Here's an ad from a jeweler in Scottsdale. What do her diamonds say about you? What we're guessing is that maybe there's some link between mating and conspicuous consumption. And so we did some studies in which we have manipulated mating motives and looked at people's spending on various kinds of things. And I won't tell you what the stimuli were. Basically, would you buy flashy kinds of items or not? Here's spending by men and women on conspicuous items in the control condition. Women spend a little more on the flashy items than men do. But activate mating doesn't do much to women's spending on conspicuous items, but now men start to flash the cash. Okay? This other thing, I should actually take this out because it's not all that interesting. It isn't that men are just spending more. They're not spending more on inconspicuous things. Women's spending doesn't change as a function of mating. Men shift their resources basically to conspicuous rather than inconspicuous items. Instead, we did another study in which we looked at your tendency to say you do something benevolent. Would you help other people? And we had both conspicuous and unconspicuous. You could help other people in ways that other people would see it. You could show off your helpfulness. Or you could do it in a quiet way, like giving money in the poor box at church or something like that. What we found in this case is that mating motive doesn't cause women to flash the cash, but it does cause them to flash their helpfulness. Women want to show off. I'm a helpful person when they're in a mating frame of mind. They actually don't do this with inconspicuous. This isn't like women just become more helpful and nurturant in general. You're not going to see it. Mating doesn't cause women to want to do it. It's like mating causes women to show off their helpfulness, men to show off their resources. Last study I'll tell you about here is another study by Vlad and Cialdini and I. If you look through history, great artists often have muses. So this was Dora Maar, who was one of Picasso's muses. And for every one of Picasso's major periods in art, he had a muse. Historically, this is more true of male artists, and the muse is typically a woman. So we wanted to see whether or not mating motivation can influence creativity in like regular folks, non-Picassos. And we did some things like, for example, tell me a story about this. And sometimes people tell an amusing story about these two guys, this guy talking about a recent nose job he had, or one guy, a very clever story, and then over there, one subject told us about it's a jazz club, those are musical notes that you see, and like gave a very elaborate review. Other people just say, yeah, it's different swatches of color. And this guy said to the other guy, good coffee. And we had them rated for how creative were they. We also did a test of ability to make quick creative associations. Is one of these things that they use. The artists are very good at doing things like this. Come up with a word, another word, that can connect to right, cat, and carbon and make a different word. It's a tough one. Copy. is the right answer. That's the right, you might have another answer, but that's the one that counts as right in this test. So this requires kind of making rapidly quick, difficult associations. Now here's what we found. We compare people in a neutral mood to people who were thinking about either short-term or long-term mating. Now typically, women scored higher, a little higher on our creativity tests, not significantly, but a little bit higher on our creativity measure in this experiment. Activate mating though, and either short-term, either thinking about a short-term relationship, you just met somebody on the beach, in Mexico, or you just met somebody on campus and you've gotten into a relationship with them. Thinking about mating in general, men start getting more creative. And it's not just that they speak more, they actually write stories that are rated as more creative, and they're better at things like the remote associates. Like men, contrary to the stereotype, men on testosterone, at least sexually aroused, they get on. They're smarter. They're cleverer. What does it do to women? Well, short-term mating does nothing to women's displays of creativity. But thinking about long-term relationships, now women start showing off how clever they are. That gets women on. So the final conclusion I'll have here is that, in the final insult to David Hume, reason is the juggling mariachi band of the reproductive passions. I'll give you a more serious closing note. Reason is the slave of the passions, but the passions are ultimately rational. Although we see occasional irrationality at the surface level, if you dig underneath, ultimately our passions are founded on a deeper rationality.